Greetings. Thank you for joining us today at Researcher Academy for our webinar, How to Turn Your Thesis into an Article, 8 Tips for Converting Your Terminal Degree for Journal Publication. Our panelists today are Drs. Adolfo Cuevas and Cecily Betts. I am Dawn Nolan, and I will serve as your moderator. We do ask that you mute your lines, and we will get started on our presentation. The process of writing a manuscript is considerably different from the work undertaken for academic degree requirements. The focus of this webinar is to provide potential authors, particularly those who have recently completed graduate studies, with suggestions for converting their academic project or completed thesis into a manuscript that is appropriate for a scholarly, peer-reviewed journal. In this webinar, a university professor, a journal editor-in-chief, and a publisher offer insight and advice on how you can ensure that your thesis goes from academic requirement to publishable manuscript. This webinar is meant to help attendees gain a clear understanding of how to successfully rewrite and edit a thesis to transform it into a publishable paper, how to identify an appropriate journal, and how to interpret submission guidelines. Before we get started, let me make a few announcements, please. Again, we ask that you mute your lines. There will be a question and answer session at the end, so please submit your questions in the text box as we go through, and we will address them at the end. Questions not handled in today's recording will be handled at the Mendeley Group for Researcher Academy. Make sure you join the group to see answers to the questions and connect with your peers about this topic. The link can be found under Resources on the bottom right-hand corner of the page for this webinar online. The presenters today will answer questions over the course of the following week. Let me tell you about our participants today. Dr. Adolfo Cuevas is an assistant professor in the Department of Community Health and director of the Psychosocial Determinants of Health Laboratory at Tufts University. Dr. Cecily Betts is professor of clinical pediatrics in the Department of Pediatrics at the University of Southern California Keck School of Medicine, Director of Research and Director of Nursing Training at the USC Center of Excellence for Developmental Disabilities at Children's Hospital Los Angeles, and she is also the Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of Pediatric Nursing. Again, I am Dawn Nolan. I am your moderator. I am an Associate Publisher in the Health and Medical Sciences Journal Division of Elsevier. Converting your terminal document into a journal article does not have to be a stressful experience. It is important that you bear in mind, let's look at what we're going to talk about today. Topics we will discuss include the following. We will explain the differences between a thesis and a journal article, and then we will give you tips for identifying an appropriate target journal, ways to shorten the thesis, how to change your introduction into an abstract, modify the introduction, tighten the method section, report main findings in the results, ensure your discussion is clear and concise, how to limit the number of your references, and the questions that you should ask to determine authorship, copyright, and publishing model. And I apologize, we had a technical glitch. I'm going to go back to the previous slide. One moment, please. All right, it's very important to realize that there are different audiences and different standards for your academic work and a journal article. An article by Hawkins et al. In the Journal of Academic Librarianship summed it up nicely. Dissertation committees assess whether a student's work has fulfilled program outcomes and requirements, not whether that work is ready for publication or even widespread release. Dissertation review certifies the student's capabilities within the context of the discipline and the institution where that work is conducted. Editors and reviewers of peer-reviewed journals are experts in their fields, and they are well-versed in scholarly communication. Their task is to assess whether papers and projects further the knowledge in those fields and thus should be published. Today we will offer 8 tips for converting your paper.
All right. I'm Cecily Betts, and I'm the Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of Pediatric Nursing. and I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to speak with you and to sort of give you some insights about what to do when you've completed now your thesis, your dissertation, and you now want to submit it for publication to a professional journal. First of all, it's important to know that there are differences between your very hard work that you engaged in terms of putting your thesis together and submitting your work for publication. So first of all, and I just want to go through some of these differences here. A thesis, as you well know, you had to meet certain academic requirements. That's different from a journal article where the requirements of the journal are different. You're writing for a different audience. There's the reference style, and just the very sort of nuances associated with the format, as I mentioned before, the writing style. Your thesis, as you well know, was reviewed by members of your committee, whereas when you submit your article, your name is not revealed to the reviewers, nor do you know who the reviewers are. But you can rest assured that those reviewers are experts in their field. So they look at your paper with a critical eye to see if your paper meets the scholarly and scientific standards, not only of the journal, but your field of practice and your field of scholarship. A thesis is predicated on chapters. As you well know, you put different chapters together that were focused on different aspects of your study. In contrast, in an article, we talk about sections, we talk about an introduction, we talk about the results, we talk about the implications for practice, we talk about limitations. Those sections look a lot different than your chapters. And Dr. Cuevas will be reviewing some of that with you shortly. As you know, you put a lot of effort into your thesis. It was a lot of work. It was lengthy. There were probably no word limits. In contrast with articles, generally speaking, they have about a 5,000 word limit, but that will vary depending on the type of article you submit, as well as the journal requirements themselves. Your thesis contained a table of contents. We don't have table of contents in articles. We have what we call the manuscript format. In your thesis, you were required to do a lengthy research of literature. In journal articles, they vary, and I might say too, they vary by discipline. Some disciplines have very brief review of literature, whereas other disciplines have more lengthy review of literatures, but nevertheless, they look very different. They're far more succinct than your thesis. In terms of like IRB approval, you were likely required to describe that in great detail. In articles, typically an IRB statement is 1 to 3 sentences at most. In your thesis, you were required to give quite a bit of description and copies of the tools, measurements that you used, whereas in an article, we ask you to be very succinct and provide only the most essential information about your tools. For example, the reliability and validity of the tools, the psychometrics. In your thesis, you presented quite a bit of your results, your findings. And in an article, this is really dependent, and probably you'll want to consult with your thesis chairs or other professionals in terms of how should I present the findings of my study, of my thesis, of my dissertation. And you may be parsing some of that out and presenting your findings actually in more than just one journal. Again, that's something that you really have to sort of very carefully consider. And I would really recommend that you get assistance in that regard. One small point I'd like to make about a thesis, and that is your verb tenses vary. You may say in a chapter, I will be doing this. Very rarely would you use a future tense in an article unless possibly when you're talking about clinical implications. And again, you want to be consistent with verb tenses. I know these are very small points, but nevertheless, these are relevant points, and certainly reviewers will be picking that up and probably commenting to you about that. Dr. Cuevas, are there any other comments you wanted to add with this slide here?
I don't, but it does support a lot of the tips I'll be providing in just a few minutes.
Okay, fine. I guess you're doing tip number 1?
I am, yes, and thank you. So first and foremost, congratulations on making it at this point of your academic career. I'm going to be presenting 8 tips on what has helped me converting my dissertation into a manuscript for publication. Oftentimes, people think that choosing the right journal for your research can seem daunting, but it doesn't have to be. By asking some very simple questions, you can actually begin to narrow down your focus, and that is the beginning of how to convert your dissertation to a manuscript for publication. So first, you can begin by talking to your supervisors, colleagues, and friends and asking them for recommendations. You could also go to your school's library to find out if there are particular journals that fit within the scope of your research. And you could also go through the journal and publishers' websites as well. It's very important to read the aims and scope of the journals that you will are thinking about submitting the manuscript to. The scope of journals is really just the journal's purpose or objective, and it's what the journal wants to accomplish by delivering that content. And that's very important to keep in mind when you're choosing the particular journal. So ask yourself this question: is my research relevant to the aims? Is the research relevant to the audience targeted by the journal? Does it accept my type of research? Some journals are much more accepting of clinical studies or qualitative papers or quantitative papers. So it's very important to begin looking to see what they actually accept in their particular journal. And also ask yourself this question: does your work fit with the other published papers? Often in the journal's websites, you will see that they have a recommended structure and reference style for the articles, and sometimes that would help you also decide whether this is the right journal for you. A typical structure would be a title page, abstract, key terms and keywords, main text as introduction, materials and methods, results, discussion, acknowledgments, declaration of interest and statement, references, appendices, tables, and figures. One thing that really helped me when I was converting my dissertation into a manuscript for publication is this really useful tool called Journal Author Name Estimator. It's also known as Jane. And here you could actually enter your abstract, and they'll give you some journal recommendations. And they have this particular tool where it relies heavily on PubMed, which contains also papers from a wide range of journals. They're also connected with Medline and Directory of Open Access Journals. And so that's another useful tool in order to narrow down your options. But I highly recommend that you ask your colleagues as well as your mentors to read over your abstract and provide some recommendations. There's also a few other key points to keep in mind in choosing the journal. Impact factor might be important for you, the site score, information for authors, journal metrics, journal announcements, and special issues. There might be sometimes that the journal have a particular issue, a special issue that has been announced, and it may fit perfectly with the kind of research work that you're doing. You can also keep in mind examples of articles previously published, and I highly emphasize this in particular because it will help in how to structure your manuscript. And also keep in mind the review process. Some may be lengthy. It might take 6 months. Others may take 3 months. And oftentimes in the journal's website, they'll have some information of the review process.
All right. I'd like to say something here about, just very quickly, about what Dr. Cuevas said about review process. And being a journal editor, you know, I'm responsible for managing reviews of manuscripts, and sometimes it happens, it's happening more and more often, where we are inviting many individuals to review papers. However, they have competing demands for their time, so then we end up having to invite considerable number of individuals, sending in the invitation, please, could you review this manuscript? And they just do not have the time because they're busy with their other academic responsibilities, so on and so forth. So sometimes when a journal states X number of days for review, it may take longer because it's difficult to find reviewers. So I just wanted to sort of add that there. What you see in front of you is entitled A Word on Predatory Journals. I don't know if you've ever heard about predatory journals, but they have come into being because we have this phenomenon in publishing, which is called open access. And Don will be referring to it a little bit later in our presentation. But open access sort of reflects what it is. You can access these journals. You don't have to pay a subscription fee, or you don't have to go through your library databases. And it's sort of the reverse, because with open access, typically then the author is charged for publishing their manuscript. This is sort of a change that's occurred of late in publishing, and it's partly to enable greater access to journal articles. And there's some very fine and very legitimate journals that are now open access. However, there are journals that are illegitimate. They're not considered journals of scholarship, and they're not considered journals that are part of the community of scientific journals. And I've put 2 references up there for you for additional information that you can seek to enable you to become more informed about those types of journals, but I felt it was important to bring that particular matter up here as we're talking about publishing, because unfortunately one time I had a author contact me, and she had published in a predatory journal, and she didn't realize it till after the fact, and it was very troublesome. So you want to avoid that for sure. All right, in our next slide here, what you will find, particularly when you're seeking to submit, finding the right fit for your manuscript with the journal, journals may have specific additional guidelines for specific type of papers. For example, PRISMA guidelines for systematic reviews and meta-analyses, CARE guidelines for case studies, CONSORT guidelines for randomized controlled trials. And if you did a quality improvement project, the journal might ask you to abide by the SQUIRE guidelines. And what these guidelines do is they're actually an organizing template to make sure that papers that are published, these particular types, that they're done correctly, they're done thoroughly, and they meet the highest criteria for scholarship. So, and I also inserted there a website that you can link up to, the Equator Network website, which has the most comprehensive listing of these specialized guidelines, and you will find them all on the Equator website. And as you're looking to find the right fit for your article, you may find that the journal specifies that if you were to submit, for example, a quality improvement project, please use the SQUIRE guidelines. And typically they have a link to those guidelines. So here you would really be altering your paper quite considerably from the requirements of your thesis. So, important point. So next, Dr. Cuevas will be going back through the other tips to assist you with the rewrites of your papers.
Great. Thank you. So the second tip is shortening the length of your thesis. So a thesis is known for having a very lengthy introduction, a very detailed description of your research approach and methodology, and a very elaborate reporting of your results, and this spills over into the discussion section as well. And this is really to show your committee members, your mentors, that you have a very strong theoretical understanding of the research that you're doing. Journal articles, on the other hand, have to be extremely focused in terms of the presentation. So these articles are expected to follow a very specific format and include a very concise literature review, a very controlled presentation of your methods section, and a very succinct discussion section as well. So oftentimes a journal article is much shorter and actually requires that you actually would cut down, say, for example, a dissertation with 100 pages that has around 20,000 words to a journal article that can be somewhere between 3,000 to 6,000 words. And that really depends on the journal. It's important to keep in mind that it's just not a matter of copying and pasting and trimming some of these texts down to reach the 6,000 words, but it really does require one to really select and repurpose key elements of the paper. So you have to be extremely careful to preserve the essence of the study while leaving out any redundant details. For your abstract, journal articles typically range anywhere between 100 to 150 to 250 words. And for dissertations, dissertations, on the other hand, they're much longer. They're usually about 350 words. So read the instructions very carefully in the journal, in the target journal that you actually chose. And some articles, some journals do require a very structured abstract, while others prefer an unstructured one. So I highly recommend you print out at least 3 articles that were recently published in that particular journal to get a good idea of how to structure your own abstract. Here is an example of my abstract from when I converted my dissertation abstract into an abstract for a manuscript for publication. And as you can see, I trimmed a lot of what was there originally. What I actually eventually presented was just the key findings of the study, and just presented a little bit more about the actual purpose of the study as well. In the before section, as you can see, there was a lot more in terms of the theoretical underpinnings of the study, a bit more details about the actual data collection, and a bit more about the analytic approach that was taken. For the introduction, you'll need to be very concise. A thesis or dissertation usually has more detailed introduction, as you would want to demonstrate your familiarity with the existing literature through a very exhaustive literature review. However, for a journal article, the literature review has to be much more succinct and has to include only as much as is required to understand the gap in the literature. So if your thesis or dissertation includes more than one research question, I believe it's important just to narrow it down to just one research question. And oftentimes that may actually relate to the target journal that you may choose in the end. So for example, in one of my, I actually developed a 3-article format dissertation, and one actually went to a public health journal. Some of the research questions I originally had were much more psychologically related. There was only one that was more relevant to public health. And so I converted that dissertation into a manuscript for publication with just one research question. For methods similar to the introduction, it has to be very concise. You want to tighten this up quite a bit. The materials and methods section for a dissertation or thesis usually includes a very extensive discussion of the research approach and methodology. However, for the journal article, it requires a much more controlled presentation of the methods. So you should limit yourself to describing only the details of the methodology that was used, specifically the experiments conducted, and a comprehensive discussion of the research approach is really not required here. I do recommend that you publish or print out 3 published papers from that journal to understand how the format differs from your dissertation and how you could actually begin to reverse engineer that particular format for your work. For results, while the thesis and dissertation usually reports each and every single result in a considerable detailed fashion, a journal article reports only the main findings, and that's really important to keep in mind in tightening this particular section up. In fact, as a result of inexperience and overinterpretation, we as students, and I'm guilty of this as well, often end up reporting results in their thesis that are not strong enough. So when it comes to a journal article, there are strict standards of reporting that should be followed, and you should only report results that are directly relevant to your research question. And if you feel the need to report findings that perhaps are not relevant to the research question, but is still relevant within the broader literature that you are a part of, you could also consider presenting secondary findings as supplementary materials if the journal does allow that. So when you reach tip 7, which is ensuring that your discussion is up to par, it should be clear and very concise. The discussion section of dissertation or dissertation, again, is usually much more detailed and provides a thorough interpretation of the results. And this is really just to help your committee members understand that you have a strong theoretical understanding of the research that you're doing. However, for a journal paper, it should be much more clear and to the point, and really find a way in terms of understanding how these findings situate themselves within the broader literature. It's important also to keep in mind, how does your research expand our perspective, and how is it perhaps a cutting edge finding in the literature?
I'd like to add here, when you're writing your discussion section, that you want to present your findings and then contrast them to what has been perhaps findings that support your own findings, those that are contrasted with your findings, but be sure to provide an explanation to enable the reader to understand how your findings, why there are these differences. Additionally, particularly when your work has application to practice in other settings, you then want to move and discuss in not overstating your findings, but to suggest how then your findings can be applied to practice. And I would say one of the problems that exists for authors is that they will overstate and say, this will change practice, we could save this amount of cost with implementation, etc. And you have to be very mindful and modest, in a manner of speaking, when you are making recommendations for practice, or you're talking about the implications, as well as the implications for future research. You want to be able to provide, in a sense, some guidance and direction to others in terms of what you have learned from your own work. Additionally, you want to speak to what were the limitations of your work and explain why those are limitations. Maybe your small sample size, there wasn't enough power in your study, perhaps what you learned about a tool that you used, or perhaps it was your research design. Those are all very insightful bits of wisdom to share with others. So limitations are important and very relevant for the readers and for your colleagues to learn what you yourself would have done differently, or what you realize were the limitations themselves.
That's great. Thank you so much for that.
We're going sort of back and forth here. All right.
Yes. The last bit of tip, and I would love to get your perspective here, Cecily, is that typically dissertations have a very exhaustive list of citations and sometimes even a bibliography. However, for journal articles, they require a very limited amount of citations. Sometimes they even recommend a certain amount, sometimes 60. It varies depending on what kind of research article you are submitting. And so some journals actually specify the maximum number of references that can be included. And similarly, it's fairly common to have a definitions section in dissertations, but this should not be included in a journal article. I do find it useful to use a reference manager system such as Mendeley or Zotero because ideally we like the first journal article that we submit our manuscript to for it to be accepted, but my experience, the first shot was not successful, and so you'll have to consider that possibility. And so having these reference manager allows you to quickly convert your reference style to fit within the journal guidelines.
Yes, and I'd like to add the following thoughts related to references. And what I see reviewers comment most frequently about is they'll say too many dated references. The writer, the author, needs to include more recent references. Now, that certainly would not hold true if you're talking about classic studies, and you certainly would want to include those that really change practice or transformative, so to speak. But it's important to ensure that you have the most current references cited in your paper, and that is something that reviewers really pay attention to. So let's say you've completed your dissertation, you've let some time go by, and you're now submitting your manuscript. And let's say you completed in, 2015, and you're now submitting 2018. You need to update those references. You have a 3-year lag there, and the reviewers would want to see references from 2017, 2016. That's just a point to keep in mind, and also the point that Adolfo had made about limit of citations. Again, that varies according to journal. And sometimes as reviewers look at your papers, they're developing a sense, even though they don't know you, but they're developing a sense of you as an author. And if you present a paper that, in their opinion, does not meet the expectations or even the format of citations, that perhaps you're not citing your in-text citations appropriately according to a particular reference model, they will make comments. And then they will think, well, this author may have not been as focused, as precise with their work, and that may have an effect in terms of how then they look at rest of your work. They look at your work in the totality of what you're presenting to them, including how you present your references. Are your references cited appropriately? Are you using the correct format, etc.? So pay attention to that factor as well.
Thank you very much to our panelists for presenting those tips. I quickly want to go through some additional questions that we highly recommend you answer before you submit your work to a journal of interest. And those are authorship, copyright, and publishing model. Let's take a look at each one of those in more detail. For authorship, you should decide at the outset who will be listed as authors of any journal articles that will come from your degree papers. That may be the committee chair, the committee members, or other academic mentors. You will need to consider people who have contributed to your data collection or analysis, and anyone else who has contributed substantially to the work itself. You need to ensure that everyone involved has a complete understanding of the roles and responsibilities for manuscript development and the submission process itself. We recommend that you follow the guidelines developed by the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors to meet the ethical standards of authorship, including these criteria. All of the authors should have made substantial contributions to the conception or design or the acquisition, analysis, or interpretation of data. They should have drafted the work or been principally involved in revising it critically for important intellectual content, have given final approval of the version to be published or even be submitted, and finally have made a commitment to be accountable for all aspects of the work in ensuring that any questions related to accuracy or integrity are appropriately investigated and resolved. Concerning the copyright, you will need to determine for certain who holds the copyright to the dissertation or capstone project and whether that copyright is all-inclusive. Does the author, the institution, or even a funding body have any claim to the copyrights? Are the text, graphics, data sets, methods, or any combination thereof all included, or are they broken apart? In some instances, researchers want to retain copyright for methods or for certain data sets, and so that needs to be determined what you are and are not willing to sign away in a copyright form. Publishers will expect authors naturally to sign copyright forms for journal articles unless the work is set to open access, which we will talk about momentarily, so the authors must know what rights they have and if they have the authority to assign them to the journal. As a publisher, I highly encourage you to talk to the journal in which you are interested to see how they handle those matters. As Dr. Betts mentioned earlier, there are two types of publishing models that are most common now. There's the traditional publishing, where authors submit their work and go through the peer review process, and when an article is accepted, it's put into a subscription-based journal free of charge. The institutions and the individuals who are paying for that content through subscribing are the ones who are paying the article processing to get it into a form that can be shared in a journal. So the author themselves are not paying anything to publish in a particular journal if it has the traditional publishing option. Open access publishing is a newer model in which the author or his or her institution or perhaps a funding agency or a grant will pay a publication fee when an article is accepted, and they will retain the copyright. What that means is that the article then is made freely available to all users who see it online. Some journals publish exclusively open access, and that's usually quite obvious. They'll have the word open or open access in their title, but many subscription journals also offer an open access option. To underscore something Dr. Betts said earlier, in a predatory journal, they will require you to pay a fee up front to even submit your work or have it undergo peer review. Legitimate journals will never ask you for any money to go through that process. If they have an open access option after your article is accepted, they will ask you if you want the open access option. And at that point, you will discuss the fee and how that is handled. There are two forms of open access. Gold open access is the most common. Again, after submission, an article publishing charge is due, and when the article is published, it can be immediately and permanently accessed by all users, not just subscribers. Green open access usually involves an embargo period. So after submission and peer review in a subscription journal, the article is published online and typically is closed to subscribers only for a limited period, perhaps a year or so. Subscribers have immediate access, but other people will have free access to it either by looking at a version that the author has archived, the publisher has deposited or linked to a government or a funding agency. Large publishers like Elsevier do offer that service, and so many funding bodies, particularly from the government, that require articles to be submitted to a repository after a certain amount of time so that they're free to the people who have funded them, we will handle that for you as well.
All right. And we thought we would conclude with what we call the golden rules. So what are some of the golden rules here? First of all, remember, you are writing for a very different audience, and you need to know who your audience is, the journal readers, and the field of practice that you're embarking upon. So it's different than your thesis committee. It's different than the discussions you've had with classmates that were in your program. You have a totally different audience. So it's important to remember that. And as Adolfo had said earlier, to look at the kinds of articles that are published in those journals that you would consider submitting to. And frankly, you will be getting an idea, in part, based upon your own work, based upon where you're selecting articles from for your own thesis that you have conducted. So you're going to get an idea, where should this article be submitted to. Important is to look at the journal website and look at the information for authors. That will be the template where you will be given sort of the guidance, the direction on the format, and the format will vary depending on the type of article you intend to submit, the word count, as has been mentioned before, the number of references. It is always, it's very useful, let's put it that way, to consult with a colleague or someone else you know, classmate, in terms of what their experience was in submitting to a particular journal. Because they will have insights that your faculty mentors may not have. And in some cases, your faculty mentors may have not published themselves. There are situations wherein that happens. So keep that in mind. They may have expertise in one area, but not in this particular area. Also, and this is just helpful to you, to have someone read your manuscript before you formally submit it to a journal. And in particular, if you're submitting to a journal for which your native language differs from the language of the journal you're submitting to, it is in your best interest to have someone who can read that manuscript and perhaps provide you with some additional tips. Or if you're feeling a little insecure, you might want to have a professional language service look at your manuscript. Also, and these rules here on the second page, and they seem to speak for themselves, and it may be difficult to sort of translate that into your own work, but content that is current, meaning also your references, clear, practical, and meaningful will ensure or help to ensure that you will be more successful. And I will tell you that reviewers will comment, like, this section was confusing. I didn't understand what the author was trying to say here. And again, if you have a colleague perhaps proofread your manuscript before you submit it, that they can provide you with very valuable advice. And, you know, sometimes reviewers will look at a paper and say, well, there's been, this topic has been published before. Or, you know, we have a body of work here, and it's like the so what? You want to be able to justify to the readership, to your colleagues in your profession, that there is reason why your paper ought to be published. Perhaps you used a different type of methodology. Perhaps your sample is one that has not been reported on before. Elements of your topic that are nuanced in terms of their differences from papers that have been published before. And as mentioned before, you know, that you review carefully the manuscript requirements of journals because they all differ, and that your language is free of your own biases, and that you present your work as objectively as possible. So I know that now Dawn is going to just review some of the resources here.
Yes. And I want to remind all of you on the line that the questions that you are asking will be answered on the Mendeley group for this webinar. You should be able to find a link for that on the bottom right-hand corner of the online page for this webinar. The presenters will get together and answer these questions over the course of the following week, and you are able to discuss these topics with the other attendees, and so we encourage you to follow up and take advantage of that. Primarily based on many of the questions that have come in for us, we very much encourage you to take advantage of Elsevier's Research Academy. It's a free e-learning platform. It can take you through the different phases of the research cycle, from the beginning of preparation for research through the publishing process, all the way to how you can track and demonstrate the impact of your work and of your publications. These resources can help bridge the gap between academic achievement and professional success. So please do take advantage of that. There are several modules about the writing process itself that go into great detail about the questions you have asked and the things that we have just touched upon in the little time that we have for our webinar. I want to point out some of the resources that we have discussed today are here. Our Researcher Academy, the Elsevier, has specific pages for people in specific roles. We highly recommend you take a look at the one for authors, but there are also one for reviewers and editors. And then some of the things we touched on, like authorship, content ownership, how to write the most effectively for your audience, and how to find an appropriate journal for your work. All of these things are listed here. This webinar and the slides therein will be available on Researcher Academy, so you can refer back to them in detail. Please note that there is a free handout to accompany this webinar, which you can download from the download section in that bottom right-hand corner of the page. It will summarize the 8 tips that we have presented and the key takeaways from today's presentation. I thank the panelists again. We have gotten many questions, and I want to offer a couple of those in the time that we have left, things for which it seemed to be a common theme. Cecily, I believe you and Dr. Cuevas touched touched on this. Someone has asked, what advice would you give regarding submission for people who have left academia and are working in nonprofit or private sectors?
I would encourage you to submit. You have a lot to offer. You have perspectives that would be of interest to others.
I agree. I think a lot that shouldn't be in any way inhibit someone from submitting a manuscript that could advance the field in even if it's a small way. It's very important for you to consider that you, even though you're not in academia, you're still an academic, and you have valuable insight to offer to other scholars.
Okay. An excellent question is, should we start writing the article before writing the thesis, vice versa, or in tandem?
That is I think that I would focus on completing your thesis. I do know that in some other countries, the process is publish your articles first. I think you're taking on, you might consider just focusing in on one piece. And perhaps as a parallel process, sort of keep in mind what you need to do subsequently. I don't know. Adolfo, what would you say to that question?
I would say focus on the thesis first. But both processes do require a lot of time, and the process will be much shorter and much more cumbersome if you're doing two at the same time. And even if you focus on the developing a manuscript for publication first and then moving on to a thesis, that's going to extend the process much more. And the thesis really does allow a scholar to identify with greater granularity some of the gaps within the literature. And you have the guidance of your mentors to help refine a lot of your research questions. So I do think it's important to start off with the thesis first, and you will soon identify what are some of the key research questions that could really advance the field once you begin to convert it into a manuscript for publication.
Okay. Here's a very good question. It's almost a technical question, but it's excellent. It says, should we use the same title of the thesis as the article headline?
I think that is sort of highly dependent on the length of the title of your thesis, and how are you going to present the findings from your thesis? Or as Adolfo had mentioned, he published 3 papers from his. So, you would have to think about then altering that thesis title into 3 different ones. So that's something worth considering. Adolfo, is there something you want to add to that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I do think it really just goes back to what's the end product of the manuscript, because you want a title that directly relates to the text, and oftentimes the text of dissertation is really comprehensive and really tries to tackle a very big question, mainly because you want to show your committee members that you really understand this particular topic. While for the manuscript that hopefully is published, the title really wants to relate more to the research question that you're directly answering.
All right. Along those lines, and someone has asked, can you separate your thesis into different manuscripts that have the same methodology?
That's sort of I do know that we get submissions of qualitative studies, and what they have done basically used the methodology, particularly qualitative approach, and published thesis from their work. And what an author will do is the primary article will describe in detail the methodology used, and then in subsequent articles they will refer the reader back to the original article and describe, and for greater detail refer back to the original article. So, Adolfo, is there a comment that you want to make there?
Just a minor one. There are some journals, especially psychology journals, that do have a slightly different format when situations like these arise, where the editor, or at least the journal, I should say, allows the author to separate the manuscript into different sub-studies, and that allows for if one is interested in submitting a very robust paper that has multiple studies using the same methods. And so that's just another thing to perhaps keep in mind.
All right. I want to address a question quickly that says, will the attendees have access to a certificate of participation in this webinar? And the answer to that is yes. You go into your Researcher Academy account and you should be able to download the certificate that says that you participated today, and we certainly appreciate you doing so. We thank all of you who have asked us questions. Again, we're going to review the questions and answer them in a Mendeley group for Researcher Academy, so please note the location of that. That should be in the bottom right-hand corner of the page for the webinar online, and check back in there over the next week or so, and we will do our best to answer your questions. We thank you very much for joining us today. We especially thank our panelists for their valuable time and insight into this. Elsevier certainly encourages all of you to work as hard as you can on your research, and we have the resources to hopefully help you in that process, and we very much believe that you should write up your work and submit it somewhere, because you will be furthering the body of knowledge in your fields, and that's an essential component of both scholarship and professionalism. So we thank you for your time, and we wish you well.